Zoom. So, hey, I want to welcome everyone. We are a proud member of the App Exchange, have been for a number of years. Very proud to have over 300 5-star ratings on the App Exchange. My name is Matthew Hutchison. I'm the VP of Product Marketing here at OwnBackup. And then today, along with my colleague, Henry Cohen, we're going to talk about how OwnBackup Archiver can help you with your data archiving goals. And to do that, I'm going to take maybe 8 or 10 minutes here on the front end to kind of talk about some of the common challenges we hear about, and then I'm going to pass the ball over to Henry, who's going to give us a demo. So one thing I think we can all agree on is that in today's always-on digital world, Salesforce customers aren't suffering from any lack of data. And if that sounds like your organization, rest assured you're not alone. And it's all really drives back to the digitization of business processes that has really created this torrent of data. So as a result, every organization that we speak with, regardless of size or their industry, really needs a strategy for managing the flow of data throughout its life cycle. That includes how it's gathered, stored, who has access, how it's shared, and of course then how it's backed up and archived. And it's really that last leg of the data management marathon that a lot of companies are struggling with, and probably one of the reasons that you joined us today. And it has a lot to do with, the ability to purge the system of data that's of limited day-to-day value, or data that's become obsolete, or data that could be regulated with internal policies or perhaps government rules. So let's talk about why organizations are struggling with data archiving. And there's a lot of competing factors that have to be weighed, and more often organizations lean toward keeping more data rather than less. And there's some real challenges with that. So on one side of the equation, you have these data privacy regulations that are compelling you to keep data for as little time as possible, while there are other regulations that can mandate data be kept for extended periods, and that could be up to 25 years if you're in a regulated industry. But on the other hand, you have these business users who need access to the data for sales and service and analytics. And everyone's concerned that if the data is no longer in production, it could negatively impact customer experience or the day-to-day business processes and decision-making that we all rely on Salesforce to help us with. So as I mentioned, too often, it's really tempting to hold on to data longer than is required rather than relocating it out of production. But that can have some real negative consequences. So, if you've got too much data in your system, that clutter can make it difficult to actually find the data that you need. It's going to expand the regulatory compliance burden. It makes it hard to govern, and it really increases exposure in the event of some type of data breach or security incident. So what I'd like to do next is kind of double click into what some of those challenges are that we hear. And it really falls into 4 buckets. We often hear that storage costs are growing and that system performance is slowing, and it's increasingly difficult to comply with those policies and regulations that we chatted about. So let's start with with the costs, and then talk a little bit about system performance. As everybody knows, Salesforce has editions, and each of those comes with some storage thresholds. So as an admin, you have to be closely monitoring file and data storage against those prescribed limits. And on the screen there, you can see an email that none of us wants to get, and that's basically saying that you've exceeded your storage limits. And if you do hit that point, you really only have a couple choices. You could buy more user licenses, or you could add more space, or you could identify some records that you need to delete. But the key is, until one of those remedies is taken, Salesforce reserves the right to prevent any further record creation. And while those data limits are certainly a consideration for every Salesforce customers, there's going to be some attributes that increase the likelihood of it being a problem. So any organization that's using Service Cloud could be experiencing high volume customer interactions, like a customer support center that manages a lot of cases and attachments. Or it could be organizations that are using apps like Encino or Viva, or perhaps you have integrations to marketing or commerce platforms that are generating a lot of data. And then, of course, the bread and butter of Salesforce is Sales Cloud. So if you've got inside sales operations generating a lot of emails, tasks, attachments, that can really eat up a lot of space. And then across the top there, you can see some of the industries where those problems are especially prevalent. It says high interaction organizations, telcos, rental companies, CPG, financial services, health and life sciences. But in addition to increasing costs, performance issues can also be a common problem or something that you have to be thinking about. So if you notice that your operations like search or reporting or dashboard rendering or calculations are slowing down, key indicator that you've got a lot of data in there you might want to be taking a look at. But the challenge is like we talked about, is a lot of Salesforce admins are hesitant to delete data because they anticipate those business leaders and users might need it in the future. Another factor to be thinking about are your internal compliance policies. So everyone we meet with, they all agree that they're critical to data governance. But even those, sometimes companies don't have them in place, sometimes they do. But even if they do have them in place, they're really difficult to enforce. So, of course, having a policy doesn't mean a lot if you're not able to govern against it. And a really great example of that is a data retention policy. So these CIOs and compliance teams, they understand the critical importance of managing data retention and deletion against a policy, but most don't know where to start. And there really is no magic button for Salesforce admins to press to get this figured out. So understanding things like the type of data that's contained in Salesforce and how that data is used and by whom, and whether it's continuing to provide value are really critical. And then once you have that knowledge, you can begin to identify data that can be moved off of Salesforce, but keep it accessible on demand without disrupting the business. And it's that last point that I just made that I want you to be thinking about when Henry shows you how easy it is to set up a data archiving policy with OwnBackup Archiver. I said there's no magic button, but to a certain extent there is. So here's a really basic example of how that data can be categorized to lay out the framework for that retention policy. So you're going to want to start by identifying all the different types of records you're storing and how that information is used by the business. And then you can classify it based off its sensitivity, how long it retains its value to the day-to-day operations, and whether it's a candidate for archiving. And then if so, how long does it need to be retained in the archive, and then who's going to need access to it while it's there. So let me give you a quick example there. Down in the third row, invoice data, I think we could all agree would be highly sensitive. And you're going to want to keep it in production for at least a year for reconciliation and for audits or customer questions. But after a couple years, it's really a prime candidate to relocate from production into the archives and then permanently delete it, say, after 10 years. And then while it's in the archives, you might want somebody like finance and administration to be able to access it should a question arise. So last, let's look at the final piece of this puzzle. And that's because earlier, we talked about that balancing act, that seesaw that I showed you of CIOs and compliance teams and how they're challenged to keep up with this huge list of ever-growing geographic and industry rules. And as we mentioned, this really involves how they manage data that's no longer actively used by the organization, but it's governed by those rules with either a minimal or a maximal retention period. And the key here is that this issue is only getting more complicated over time. Nobody on this call is going to be having to deal with SEC 17A4 and, which is financial services, and HIPAA or GDPR, CCPA, all of these things. The thing to think about here is that there's new regulations coming out all the time, and each of those has stipulations about how that data needs to be retained and accessible for those certain periods of time. So the key point is this is a fluid environment. We don't know what regulations are going to be in place in 6 months. So now really is the time to implement the processes and the technology to support this secure, immutable archiving of data. Which brings us to OwnBackup. So what I'd like to chat about now, just at a very high level, is how you can overcome some of those challenges involved in that data lifecycle chain that I showed you earlier. So the solution that we're going to be showing you today, it's designed specifically for Salesforce customers that are looking to achieve those or overcome those objectives that I talked about, or those challenges I talked about. It's reducing the amount of data on production systems, reducing storage costs, improving system performance, and then achieving that better, all of that data governance that we had talked about. So one of the key benefits of Archiver is that it makes it super easy for admins to define, automate, and manage custom data retention policies that include specific data to be archived, how frequently that data archiving activity occurs, and then how long the data is retained. And then once those policies are configured, it removes those specific records and attachments from production and securely stores immutable replicas so they can't be changed to the cloud without changing the integrity of that data relationship. And you'll notice that I'm really careful with my wording. I always talk about removing or relocating, not deleting. Yes, it can be deleted from the archives once that policy is set, but this is not a permanent, once it's gone, it's gone. We're actually just relocating it for you to a place where it needs to be or where it can be easily accessed when it's needed. And then the same point that I just made really is true of managing the archives. So there's dashboards in there that provide access to both your past, present, and future archive operations. And then with these advanced search capabilities, it's simple to locate any data that's been archived. And that's especially valuable if you need to locate data for an audit or to remove data to comply with a privacy request, like a right to be forgotten or a request to change data. Because remember, that data doesn't have to be just modified in your production environment. It's got to be in all of your archives as well. So we make it super simple to make that happen. And then we also talked about making sure that we're relocating the data, but we're doing so in a way that's not going to interfere with business users. So to make sure that that doesn't happen, we can make those archived records visible to any user that you specified from directly within the system. So what it enables you to do is set permissions to allow them to view and potentially even restore archived records on the parent record, and they can do that from directly within Salesforce. So it's pretty powerful stuff there. Then the last piece before I toss the ball over to my friend Henry is to talk just about how we can help you to monitor how much space you have left in Salesforce and how much you've already relocated over to Archiver, because it provides these really concise snapshots of your archiving and unarchiving history, and the ability to manage all the permissions you need to assign authorization for things like archiving and restoring data. So hopefully that provides a solid background for you on where kind of what our thinking is and the challenges that we're trying to solve for our customers. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the ball over to Henry. Henry, I'm going to stop sharing and you can pick up.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I'll share my screen and we'll jump right into the demo. I'm actually not allowed to share right now. There we go.
Sharing is caring here, Henry. You should be good to go now.
Excellent. So the OwnBackup Archiver is a managed package that you install in your Salesforce environment. And the main reason OwnBackup built it that way is, as Matt said, we want to give you the ability to archive data out of Salesforce, but still interact with that data in your day-to-day within the Salesforce application. And I'd say there are really two different personalities that use the archiver in different ways, the administrator and the Salesforce end user. And so I want to take you all through how both of those personalities use the archiver to really enhance their Salesforce experience. So let's say I'm a Salesforce administrator and I know that I've been nearing my storage limits and I don't want to pay for more storage. So I install the OwnBackup Archiver to start archiving data out of Salesforce. So I log in and I'm immediately taken to my Archiver homepage, to the Archiver dashboard. And you can see some really important pieces of information here. First off, you can see your Salesforce storage. So you can very clearly see on this graph that cases are taking up a majority of my storage in Salesforce. You can also see your Salesforce storage versus your Archiver storage here. You can see in this org that I've already significantly reduced my Salesforce storage usage simply by archiving data. And this is a good place to note that with the Archiver, we offer unlimited storage, so it doesn't matter how much data you're archiving out of Salesforce, it's still going to be the same. Now, coming down here, we also have some important settings that I'd like to share with you all that help you utilize the Archiver. So if we click on that button, we'll get a window with a few settings. First off, it'll show you which user the Archiver is logged in as. And you'll also see the unarchived retention period. That's the number of days that pass after a record has been archived, after a record has been unarchived, before it will be archived again. And the use case for that, what we've seen is that sometimes records are archived because the criteria for the policy archive those records, but your users still need that record in Salesforce. So you unarchive the record, and if you set the retention period to 30 days, that record won't be re-archived for another 30 days, even though it matches the criteria for archiving. You can also set the API limit. If you're concerned about your Salesforce API usage, you're able to set an API limit for the archiver. The hot data archiver protection, this is a fail-safe that's kind of made to make sure that any data that's less than 90 days old is not going to be archived. So it's relatively new data. Even though it matches criteria, it still won't be archived because it's new data. It might still be needed. We also have the option to either hard delete or soft delete. That's either going to move the data to the recycle bin or just archive it completely and not even put it into the recycle bin. The archiving based on lookup relationships gives you the ability to include additional related data in your archiver settings. So as we all know within Salesforce, there are really two core types of relationships, master details and lookup relationships. With master details, when you delete that parent record, the child records automatically get deleted as well. So by default, when OwnBackup archives a parent record, the children will get archived with it and will maintain those relationships even after the records are archived. But with lookup relationships, when you delete the parent, the child doesn't get deleted. They simply stay in Salesforce as orphaned records. So OwnBackup here gives you the ability to include additional relationships under the parent records that are related via a lookup to maintain those relationships when the record has been archived. So I come into my Views tab here to see how my archiver is being used. So first off, you can see that every single action that's taken in the archiver, whether we're unarchiving data, whether we're archiving data, is being logged. And log files are also being generated for every action that's taken here. So if there are any errors, any kind of warnings, you'll be able to see those warnings in these error logs. And now we'll go to our archiving policies to see which data we're archiving. You can see that in my environment here, I'm archiving a pretty hefty amount of data. I'm archiving emails, invoices, attachments, cases, tasks, as well as contracts. So let's click into one of these policies. We'll click into the closed cases policies to see what that looks like. So you can see here that I have a policy on the case, and it's actually scheduled to run monthly on the 14th of the month at 12 p.m. And actually, if you come down here to edit the policy, you can change the frequency from daily, weekly, or monthly to run this policy as often as you need based on your needs. And here we have the ability to create the filters. You can see that I selected a filter where is closed equal to true because I'd like to archive closed cases. And you can also add additional conditions as well as modify the SOQL query manually. If you're a little bit more on the technical side, you'd like to write a little bit more of a complicated query, you are able to write that manually as well. Or if you're more comfortable with the dropdowns, you can build the filters those ways. And then we come down here and select some fields for the layout configuration. Now, what this is referring to will become clear later on in the demo, but I would like to clarify that we are archiving the entire record. But in terms of the preview that's shown to you after the data has been archived, these are the 4 fields that you'll see mainly. So I can also click into the advanced button here, and here's where I can add additional lookup relationships and also set the retention period per policy. And that can go up to 10 years. So I click close here, and then I click save. Now, once I click save, the policy has been saved, and it's going to run monthly, but I also have the ability to run it manually on demand whenever I'd like to. So I'm just gonna click run now here to run this policy. And you'll see that I actually do have some closed cases in Salesforce. So we'll give this a minute to run. And while this runs, it's basically going to identify these records and archive them along with, along with all their child records out of Salesforce. And once they're archived, you'll then be able to go to the parent record of the case and see the archive data. So these cases, while they're in Salesforce, they belong to an account. So they've probably been archived now. I'll refresh the page, and you can see that they're now gone because they've been archived. And that's really how the administrator uses the OwnBackup Archiver. So let's switch gears and talk about an end user. So I'm a user, I log into Salesforce, and I have an account that I manage called the Acadia Realty Trust. Now, I know that I had some cases yesterday that were closed out and they were archived, but I still need to take a look at them because there were some details in there that I need for my work today. So I click into the account and I go to the Archiver tab. And now we're going to load data that has been archived that belong to this account. Now, let me emphasize that what you're looking at here is not Salesforce data. This is now data that's not stored in Salesforce. It's stored in the OwnBackup Archiver, but because these cases were related to this account when they were in Salesforce, we maintained those relationships, and you're still able to see those cases under the account. And you can also search for them. So if I want to search for a case here, I can find a case. And here's a case that I searched for, that I've archived before. And see these field headers here. These are the fields that I selected before in the field configuration. I can also click on this icon to see the full case details. So you can see all the fields of the case with the layout straight from Salesforce. And you can even see the related data. So all those child records were also archived along with the case. Even attachments were archived. You can download them and preview those attachments right from within Salesforce. So we are going to take all of those files, maintain the relationships, archive them, and still give you the ability to view those attachments within Salesforce, even though they're no longer taking up space in your Salesforce storage. Coming back to the search results, you're also able to unarchive data. So if you made a mistake, you don't want this record to be archived, no problem. Just click on that button and we'll unarchive that record, and it'll be back in Salesforce within a couple of minutes. We do also have a global search. Now, this is great for searching across all of your archived data. So you saw before I have cases, tasks, and invoices and contracts. So I can come into here, just put in the search term, and that's going to search across all my archived data. And you can see that returns both cases and tasks. You can add a date range, and you can even update the field layouts per object. So a lot of flexibility here in using the global search. I will also add that we do have several permission sets that allow you to control access to these functions, because we certainly can understand why the global search might be a tool that you'd like to limit to only a handful of users. So we do have several permission sets that allow you to control access to these tools. Last but not least, I want to talk about reporting. We hear from a lot of our customers that even though the data is being archived out of Salesforce, they still need to report on it. They'd like to report on Salesforce data along with the archived data. So OwnBackup has actually built in the ability to export your archived data to an S3 bucket of your ownership. So you can take all of this data, export it to an S3 bucket, and then using a reporting tool of your choice, such as Tableau or ClickView or even Einstein Analytics, you can then generate reports and build components that combine your Salesforce data along with your archived data. And all of the data that you've archived is being tracked here, so you can always come in here and see exactly how many records you've archived per object. And that's everything I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll pass this back to wrap things up.